Germans and their allies invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. And by the middle of July, Army Group North had advanced towards Leningrad, although it hadn't achieved its objective. Army Group Center had advanced more successfully and captured Smolensk, and was about 400 kilometers away from the capital, Moscow. Army Group South, much like Army Group North, was advancing more slowly towards Kiev. That's the situation more or less in the middle of July 1941. There's almost universal agreement among the German generals that the future of the campaign entailed an immediate advance towards Moscow, which was the capital and therefore the political and bureaucratic center, the center of the railways network in the Soviet Union, and a significant industrial area. If you believe Soviet resistance prevented a further advance from Smolensk, starting in July and continuing on until October. Some historians, and I will be covering several of them, seem to argue that it was sensible to divert the armored forces of Army Group Center to the south to assist in the destruction of Soviet forces there and captures Kiev as well as the economic resources of the Ukraine, as well as sending some of the other armored forces from Army Group Center to assist in the Battle of Leningrad. I'm going to argue that the, traditional position that the German generals were right and that the thing to do after Smolensk was to immediately pursue an attack on Moscow was the right thing to do, contrary to the historians that I will be looking at. I want to point out that this didn't come out of nowhere. There's a few videos. The main reason why Germany lost World War II, oil, by TIK History, as well as Germany could not win World War II by Potential History, and Barbarossa, the major errors and blunders, or why Barbarossa failed, by Military History Visualized, which combined have more than 7 million views and something like 100,000 likes, and all of them take the position that Hitler was right. Going north and south after Smolensk was the right thing to do. Well, I disagree. And now we're going to look at some of the historians and their arguments as to why they think that it was a good idea, and I hope to show that it wasn't. So let's start with David Stahel, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and his book Operation Barbarossa and Germany's Defeat in the East. Now this is, the setting here is July 1941, as the Germans have made tremendous advances on the Eastern Front. If Halder was captivated by the allure of impending success, Hitler was less certain. The dictator felt the weight of strategic decision being forced upon him and vacillated as he tried to identify the shortest possible road to victory. The generals were basically arguing for Moscow. He wasn't so sure about that. From intelligence and past Soviet deployments, it seemed clear that the greatest enemy strength was to be found on the road to Moscow. But Hitler was skeptical of treading this path. And now we get into why. Well, Army Group Center, Bach's Army Group, Bach's powerful forces had twice lunged in this direction, destroying large Soviet armies but bringing no result and entangling themselves in long, fierce battles. Hitler had already identified the problem of such large strategic maneuvers and had proposed smaller encirclements, but he was soon forced to accept that while these held better prospects for operational success, because of their size, they had far less strategic importance. It's a problem they never really solved, but the fact is that the encirclements that happened were extremely weak, and so our, massive forces could escape the encirclements that the panzers achieved. But that doesn't mean that they managed to get out completely intact. Armies that have to retreat in a manner like this are not really combat capable immediately. But anyway, the fact remained that the Red Army had not, as intended, been destroyed in the initial battles, and a renewed thrust on Moscow, as the OKH advocated, seemed too much like reinforcing failure, having already failed twice to achieve the desired result. Hitler also saw no war-winning potential in seizing Moscow. To the south, however, he saw the prospect of an immediate success over the Soviet southwestern front and the opening of the resource-rich eastern Ukraine to his forces. Yet this was hardly an annihilation strategy and would mean the bulk of the Red Army remained active in the field with even less time to deal with it before the onset of winter. As a result, there was hardly a general to be found who supported such a move. Yeah, because it was a dumb move. That would be the fundamental truth. It's a dumb move. Because the goal of this war is to end it quickly. And you're not going to end it by grabbing supplies. You need to defeat the army, you need to defeat the government, you need a victory. Hitler knew better than many of his generals that Germany was unfit to bear the economic burden of a long war. This comes up in all of the material that I'll review. This sense of, Hitler was being sensible here, and his generals were being unrealistic because it had to be a long war. And the thing is, well, that's not what they planned for, it's not what they intended. But anyway, thus, it remains an open to speculation whether Hitler's desire to secure economic objectives in the South, which were made abundantly clear during the planning stages of Operation Barbarossa, now assumed a heightened sense of urgency, betraying perhaps a lack of faith in an outright German victory and revealing Hitler's growing concern over control of the Soviet Union's economic heartland. Well, the thing is, I'm not aware of a single war in history where you achieve victory by seizing economic assets. It's just as long as the army and the government remain intact, you're not going to win purely on economic grounds. You can argue that controlling the resources is important, but the fact is the forces arrayed against Germany at this time were already overwhelming and were only going to get worse because the Americans were determined to support both the British and the Soviet Union. So I don't really see the logic that's being developed here. Maybe somebody can put a comment, explain it to me better than the author. The principal commanders at Army Group Center and at the OKH correctly determined that Hitler's preference for a southwest swing would not lead to a comprehensive victory over the Soviet Union in 1941. Yet their own plans for shattering the Red Army and seizing Moscow were reflective of the same wildly unrealistic optimism that had undermined Barbarossa from the very beginning. Yeah, see, this is, I don't know how you can stand by that position. They're clear that they're not going to be able to defeat the Soviet Union by going after resources. They have a plan. But it's wildly unrealistic, and yet I think we can argue. I'll ultimately be able to argue, just based on the sources I'm using, that they had the ability to do that. Now, then we take a digression here, which is kind of amusing, because on the Soviet side, Stalin's most successful commander of the war, Marshal Zhukov, summed up the German summer campaign like this: gross miscalculations and mistakes were made in political and strategic estimates. That's actually true. The forces at Germany's disposal, including satellite reserves, in other words, allies, were clearly inadequate for waging simultaneous operations in the three major sectors of the Soviet-German front. It's kind of true. Kind of. Because of this, the enemy was compelled to halt his drive towards Moscow and to assume defensive positions on that front in order to divert part of the forces of Army Group Center to the support of Army Group South, facing our troops on the central and southwest fronts. Now, Zhukov's position is kind of odd. I know where he's coming from, because the success in the south was less, and there was a flank developing. By going south, you destroy that threat to the flank. But the problem with that position is that that's not Blitzkrieg. And I think even Zhukov knows that Blitzkrieg was all about taking that risk. That exposed flank was something that the Germans also had in the Battle of France and the Low Countries. So, while the German generals later found it convenient to blame Hitler's interference, the harshness of the Soviet climate and the sheer numerical superiority of the Soviet Union, the fact remains that their plans for the conquest of the Soviet Union were simply attempting too much. And I'll just add here the rest of this. Germany's successes in the early weeks of the war were enough to severely batter the Red Army. And we're talking about pretty much destroy the frontier forces, or at least make them combat ineffective. Yet these came to at an unexpectedly high cost to the motorized divisions upon which the Blitzkrieg success depended. While Germany still needed to do more, in fact much more, to topple the Soviet Union in late August 1941, the offensive strength simply no longer existed. And yet, the motorized divisions had the offensive strength to drive south and achieve one of the greatest victories in the battle for Kiev, in encircling and destroying the armies of Southwest Front, I believe, basically destroying the entire front. So how does that work? That's kind of where I'm just baffled, in a sense, because it seemed clear, at least from my perspective, that they obviously had offensive strength. And here we go. Now this is actually a crucial set of statements. Operations now shifted to the south and north, and yeah, there was also while the Panzer Group 2 went south, there were elements of Panzer Group 3 went north to assist in the sealing Leningrad. And this part here, it just seems to say everything to me. By doing so, it was no longer a Blitzkrieg campaign. Now it was a war of endurance. And in such a war, the Soviet Union, backed by its allies in the West, was already in a favored position. And in other words, a war of attrition, which Germans across the board were pretty clear was going to be hard to, if impossible to win. This is not the kind of war they could afford to fight. They could fight a blitzkrieg. They could not fight a war of attrition. And I just want to add the next part here. No one could yet predict the collapse of the Third Reich, nor a Soviet occupation of Berlin. But by forfeiting its only possibility of eliminating the Soviet Union, Germany was destined for a long war against an emerging superpower which it could not hope to overcome. Now, I mean, maybe someone else can explain to me how to read this without reading into it that essentially the generals were right, or at least stood a chance in going for Moscow. The turn south and north and south eliminated the possibility of victory. And hence, Operation Barbarossa's failure was more than just a lost campaign. The scale and importance of the Eastern Theater ensured that the summer of 1941 was the turning point of World War II. Now, you can argue about what was the turning point and so forth, and I'd say that, you know, the traditional argument, Stalingrad, pretty much still holds. I mean, they had a second chance in the summer of 1942. A much less likely success possibility, but I mean, they had the chance to try for Moscow in 1942 again. Because again, the Soviet armed forces were layered in front of Moscow. So there was a chance, but nowhere near what the what it was in 1941. In the strategic crisis that dominated the German command for a month in July and August 1941, Hitler emerged the undisputed victor. Absolutely. He not only asserted his authority over the army and prevailed against almost unanimous opposition from his generals, but his strategic choice was certainly the wiser alternative given both German logistical constraints and the dreadful Soviet strategic deployments in the South. How do you reconcile what I just read from a couple pages before with this statement? I mean, that's, you know, not going for Moscow seems to me to be what he's referring to as forfeiting the only possibility of eliminating the Soviet Union, and made this war into a war of attrition, which they couldn't win. But going south was a wiser choice. I don't know. I mean, that's very hard to rationalize, even in the context of this argument, which, by the way, does a great job of showing all the weaknesses and so forth. And it's got footnotes, which is really cool because it gives you direct and immediate indication of what sources are being referenced for the points being made. It's a lot easier than endnotes. Publishers take note. moving right along, the German generals, from a strictly professional standpoint, one has to question their role in the military failure of the war against the Soviet Union. They were arguing for an attack on Moscow. Far from the picture presented in many publications which in the early years of World War II laud the German early years and post-war, laud the German field marshals as grand operators and the panzer commanders as dashing innovators of a revolutionary military concept. This study presents a contrasting image. In August 1941, when the supply system was greatly overextended, the Army Group's offensive strength widely dispersed and the refitting incomplete, the generals argued for an offensive towards Moscow, which was in practical terms impossible to realize. Surely these men could see the problem posed by the vast extent of the Soviet Union and could calculate for themselves the logistical and military costs of continued operations. And yet operations did continue. And I think that this is part of what just becomes really frustrating about taking this position, is operations did continue. Panzer Group 2 went south. I doubt very much that the logistics were any easier moving substantially south than moving substantially east. And so why is it incompetence on their part? I mean, it's just, and we'll get into this a little bit later too. One wonders what they had learned from weeks of warfare over the Soviet Union's roads and against the Red Army's relentless counterattacks. Had these not weakened the all-important motorized formations to a critical point? Well, obviously not, right? Because the fact is they continued to operate, and they've not only carried out the operations to the south and north, but then also carried out another offensive up, much weakened because of those side moves, but they carried out an offensive towards Moscow that reached pretty close to Moscow. So, you know, if you follow the original plan, there's probably very little doubt that they'll reach Moscow, and yes, they'll have a massive exposed flank. That was part of the risk. This was never going to be some cakewalk, and I don't think anybody expected it to be. It's a very strange position to hold. But anyway, how were the chronic supply problems going to be solved adequately to sustain the next big push before too much time elapsed? They never solved it. I mean, everyone can agree that German logistics were just razor thin, right? I mean, there was very little room with respect to success here. I mean, it was the margins were just unbelievably thin, and yet they managed. And I think that's what matters here, is that somehow or other, despite the fact that their logistics just, you know, boggle your mind, they managed to keep going. And not only survived, but I mean, they go on the offensive again in 1942. And according to Stahel himself, you know, they seemed to do not too bad in the, you know, well-known Soviet counteroffensive that began in December. So, you know, they were chronic supply problems, but they dealt with them. And by the way, worth noting, I mean, they also had their troops live off the land and so forth, which probably didn't do anybody who was living in that area much of a favor. But nonetheless, you know, we're not debating war crimes. We're looking at what was the right choice and how how is Germany going to succeed? And it's not going to succeed by grabbing resources in the Ukraine. It's going to succeed by taking Moscow, disrupting the government, and bringing about a collapse of the Soviet will to resist. That's what this war was supposed to be about. And the move south was critical in undermining that. And I mean, that seems to be what Stahel himself is argued earlier about, that this, the move north and south was essentially no longer a Blitzkrieg campaign. So, next question. Where were the reserve units to help plug the gaps in the line and later fill the vacuum of space in the still-to-be-conquered territories? Again, they were very short. I mean, they didn't have enough men, they didn't have enough material. But the novelty of Blitzkrieg had a expiration date stamped on it, because you couldn't expect this to continue to be successful. Sooner or later, your enemies would figure out how to counter it. I think too little attention is paid to precisely that aspect of this tactic that had strategic consequences. Not my idea, by the way. But I don't remember who first said it, who first described Blitzkrieg in that manner. But that's ultimately the thing. It's like, I don't think you could achieve a Blitzkrieg in 1944. You just weren't going to achieve it, because at that point nobody panics about, German panzers marauding 20 or 30 kilometers behind what you think is the front line. They didn't panic. I mean, the Americans didn't panic in the Battle of the Bulge. Why is that? Because, you know what, it was clear what's going on, and they understood what's going on, and they didn't panic. But in the early war period, when this was a utterly novel experience, the response to finding out that there are enemy troops kilometers behind the line is that you're being surrounded and you need to get out. Panic is the result. But that can't be sustained in the long run. Anyway, the fact that none of these men were pointing to Barbarossa's impending failure, to say nothing of urging some form of negotiated settlement before it was too late, is itself an indication that the German generals were unaware of how much trouble the campaign was in. I think they were painfully aware of how much trouble they were in. Hence, the massive obstruction of the plan to go north and south, the arguments back and forth, the effort to minimize the amount of forces being diverted. I think they were painfully aware that, when they actually end up driving on Moscow, that was a Hail Mary. That maybe it would succeed, chances are it wouldn't, but you had to try, because it was their best hope of ending this war. Although I think that, realistically, that was hopeless. Alright, let's have a look at Stefan G. Fritz's Ostkrieg, Hitler's War of Extermination in the East, as another source that discusses the move south. On 19 July, at the height of the fighting at Smolensk, the OKW issued Führer Directive number 33, which reflected Hitler's recognition that the large-scale encirclement operations had not achieved decisive success, and that such success was not likely to be expected soon. Fair interpretation of what was presented. The order took account of the fact that significant time would still be required to eliminate the remnants of Soviet forces in the Smolensk area, a task that was to be left to the infantry. The bulk of the two Panzergruppen would then be shifted to the north and south to support the drive on Leningrad and to clear the Soviet Fifth Army from the Pripyat marshes. I hope I pronounced that close. Here's the kicker. Hitler's order appeared neither unrealistic nor unreasonable. In fact, however, Halder protested immediately and sought to have it cancelled, worrying that it presaged a disastrous abandonment of a concentrated attack on Moscow. In response, on July 23rd, Hitler issued the supplement Directive 33, which could hardly have calmed Halder down. I just want to say something here, and that is the position being taken here that Hitler's order is not unrealistic nor unreasonable. Of course it's unreasonable, because those forces are supposed to be preparing, in other words, resupplying, which, reading some of the other sources, the argument is being made that there are severe logistical constraints on the German forces, and so they have to stop at Smolensk. If they can be sent north and south, they can be sent east. I think that's the thing that needs to be drawn out of this. Is it makes no sense to say that somehow or other, and let's keep in mind here also that the battles for Minsk and Smolensk, Smolensk was still ongoing at this point. Let's keep perspective that at no time was the infantry not busy either marching forward or eliminating pockets of resistance. So that was an ongoing thing. It was a question of, were you going to keep going with that and move east, or were you going to try to do the same thing to the north and the south, which were clearly lagging behind Army Group Center. Halder understood immediately the implications of this directive, which meant a fundamental shift in the operational strategic objective from the destruction of the enemy combat power in front of Moscow to occupation of vital economic regions. And that's exactly the problem, right? I mean, at the end, you're aiming to collect the spoils of victory before you've achieved victory. I think that's a fair way to describe what's being proposed here, and why there's pretty much universal opposition to this plan. You haven't won. You haven't defeated the army. You haven't caused the collapse of the government. Those are the things that Blitzkrieg is supposed to do. And then you can collect all the spoils you want. All the economic stuff comes flowing to you as a result. So again, it's really it is a really serious question. Halder and Bach expected the capture of the Soviet capital to induce such political shockwaves that the entire system would collapse. Halder also raised a new and disquieting concern. The Germans lacked sufficient time and strength to complete Operation Barbarossa's plan before winter. The Russians, he noted, were desperately trying to delay the German advance until the onset of winter. If reduced to positional warfare, Halder warned the enemy would be able to organize its defenses and mobilize its industries so that the next spring the Wehrmacht would face newly raised and equipped Soviet formations. As a result, the military goal of the war against Russia, the rapid elimination of one opponent in a two-front war in order to turn full strength against the other, England, could not be achieved. Halder concluded that the enemy had to be decisively weakened, but not yet completely defeated, and thus that the aim of future operations had to be the destruction of the enemy's ability to resist. that is perfectly reasonable as an objective. And that's, you know, what again you find I find frustrating when dealing with this argument of the lateral moves made sense. Halder's right. I mean, that's your plan. I mean, there's a lot to say about, you know, the way this was all approached, but at the end of the day, the objective is the destruction of the army and the government. It is not about collecting spoils. Collecting spoils happens as a consequence. You basically putting the cart before the horse, so to speak. And in the German army, there were a lot of carts with horses. Hitler was not impressed by Halder's arguments, not least because he considered the capture of Soviet economic and oil resources of far greater importance in undermining the enemy ability to resist. You know what? And this comes up whenever oil gets brought up, that, you know, the Germans had no chance. They were running out of oil, and, you know, if they didn't get the oil, they'd end up immobilized. And yet, you know, still in 1945 they were operating. So how do we explain that? Well, we explain it by saying that, you know what, the supply situation was not decisive. Logistics managed. They didn't do well, but they managed. They had severe problems at every stage of the war, and yet they always found a viable solution. And that's what I just don't, I just do not get how the argument is supposed to be played out here. But anyway, in the event, it was no less Halder's arguments and more the reality of growing Soviet strength and increasing German supply difficulties that caused Hitler first to suspend and then to cancel the supplement to Directive 33. Yeah, there were Soviet counterattacks of increasing ferocity by troops and formations that were really basically just called up. And the truth is, the Soviet Union had a significant number of reserves, much more than the Germans anticipated. But at the end of the day, those troops were being decimated as quickly as the Soviets could put them forward. And attacking just made it easier. And there's no reason to believe that an advance would have changed that. It probably would have heightened the destructiveness of the Soviet attempts to hold their positions by attacking. Amid much vacillation, the July crisis of the German military leadership was thus ended, at least temporarily, although it was clear that after the replenishment period a decision would still have to be taken. The crucial decision, for or against Moscow, had merely been postponed. Nor, in retrospect, is it clear that Halder's arguments were markedly better than Hitler's. Really? I mean, really? In view of the logistics situation, any further advance on the Central Axis was for the time being out of the question. And yet, the panzer groups moved to the north and south, and I don't think they shifted logistically from being attached to Army Group Center. How do you deal with that? The Quartermaster General's staff had already concluded that a major attack on the Central Front was infeasible, since an adequate rate of supply to sustain an offensive could not be provided. Yeah, and during this period there was also a lot of attempt to minimize the capability of the German forces, mainly to give the North, Army Group North and Army Group South time to keep advancing. Halder was very hopeful that this would, you know, obstruction of Hitler's directives would be enough to basically allow those groups to move forward and therefore eliminate any rationale for diverting forces. But that didn't happen. At the same time, Hitler's decision corresponded with continued fighting still raging in the Smolensk pocket. So the stable situation necessary for replenishment of the front units did not exist. You know, again, we're always just round and round. It's like it's always, oh, their supply situation's untenable, but they're able to supply movements to the north and south. How is that? I mean, it's one or the other in my mind. I mean, either you can supply the forces that are deployed to whatever minimal requirements exist, or you can't. And it just seems, to me at least, that that's part of the problem here, is that you can't argue it both ways, and yet that's exactly what a lot of these authors seem to be doing. They're arguing it both ways. They're saying it's like it's impossible to advance east because logistics, because resistance, but it's possible to advance north and south. It's like, but the military objective, and that has to always be at the back of your mind as you're discussing this stuff. The military objective is destroy the army, destroy the government. So how does that work out? Soviet forces in the Pripyat marshes did represent a significant threat to the flanks of both Army Group Center and Army Group South, as well as a menace to the already strained supply lines of the 6th Army. In addition, large numbers of Soviet troops, some 6 divisions, were tied down in combating enemy forays from the swamps. Even Bach admitted that a precondition for any further operation is the defeat of the enemy on the Army Group's flanks, both of which were lagging far behind. As a result, by the late summer of 1941, the envelopment of Kiev was probably the only major operation feasible. Now that's an argument that goes more towards the military side of this. Well, Army Group Center had increasingly long flanks because they were advancing much faster, more successfully than either Army Group North or Army Group South. And consequently, there's a case to make here that they had to do something about that first before they could keep advancing. But that goes contrary to everything about Blitzkrieg. Again, as has been mentioned earlier, I mean, exposed flanks were just a part of the reality of the way Blitzkriegs fought. And motorized formations broke through the lines and moved forward at speeds that the infantry could not keep up with. And as a consequence, there was no continuity, and so generally had gaps emerge in the line where there was literally no Germans. And as I've mentioned in another segment already, there was a definite expiry date as to how long this kind of campaigning could be successfully carried out before your enemies were going to learn how to defeat that and realize that it's like, yeah, you've got marauding panzers, so what? They're cut them off. Okay, block their line of communication, which was virtually non-existent at any given point in time. Despite the failures of the encirclement battles at Minsk and Smolensk, and I mean, okay, how do you call them failures? They netted massive numbers of prisoners, multiple Soviet armies being destroyed, but they're failures. Because why? Because some of the troops escaped. I really find that a questionable position, but anyway, despite the failures of the encirclement battles at Minsk and Smolensk to destroy the Soviet will and ability to resist, however, Halder could think of nothing else but to try again. If the remnant of the Red Army was to be destroyed, it would have to be done in front of Moscow. And that's actually a fact. That's not Halder's opinion. It's like that's where the Soviet armed forces are located. So if you have any hope of destroying them, it is by attacking there. That's fact. That's not Halder's wishful thinking. It's like, you know what? Okay, we haven't destroyed the will to resist yet. You know, after Minsk, we haven't eliminated the will to resist after Smolensk. Hopefully after Moscow, but we got to keep going because that's where they're flooding in troops, and that's where we need to keep fighting to keep them off balance, keep the movement of the Blitzkrieg going. Hitler, on the other hand, drew an entirely opposite conclusion. If the Soviets were, indeed, massing their last forces in front of the capital, that surely meant easier pickings in the north and south. That's kind of like two boxers in a ring, and one of them decides that, well, yeah, it's pretty hard to actually hit the guy, so what I'm going to do is just try to avoid hitting him, because that'll surely win me the match. I mean, that's kind of how this sounds. It's like you're not going after easy pickings, you're going after defeating the army, you're going after defeating the government. You need to do those things in order to have those easy pickings. It was no problem for, once the French will to resist, which once they lost Paris happened relatively quickly. But I mean, the will to resist is exactly what this is all about. And if you haven't destroyed that will to resist, you haven't got the ability to advance without resistance. Hitler's moment of strategic realism had immediate operational implications for Germany. If Germany could not destroy enemy forces, economic considerations became paramount. Do you know how crazy that is? It's like, well, we can't defeat you, so we're just going to grab some stuff. This makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, it's argued, and I mean, I think Fritz does Stahel, a number of people do it. I mean, they all point out how, without more economic resources, Germany has no chance of winning, so therefore it's got to go for economic resources. The only way it can acquire those economic resources is by actually winning. All of the resources that it had acquired up to Operation Barbarossa had been achieved by conquering and defeating enemies. And then we have this gem. Hitler justified his operational priorities not only with the usual political and economic arguments, but with military considerations as well. He stressed, as Bach had already conceded, it's necessary to eliminate the enemy threat on the flanks before launching any attack on Moscow. So the operation into Ukraine to secure economic resources would at the same time serve the aim of securing the southern flank of Army Group Center. And to be honest, Halder's position on this fine point was correct. It's like, again, we're fighting a blitzkrieg, taking risks, and an exposed flank is pretty much a risk you have to take if you're going to succeed, because you've got a time limit. The enemy will learn what you're doing, they'll figure out how to counter it, but the Soviets were certainly not there in July and August, or even later, in 1941. As was demonstrated by the fact that the North and South moves did succeed, and then ultimately Operation Typhoon, or the move, the drive on Moscow, was initially very successful. So I don't know. I don't know how that argument is supposed to be sustained. So, now we get to the wonderful meeting that's regurgitated over and over again. On the evening of August 24th, Hitler allowed Guderian, in the absence of Halder, to make the case for an attack on Moscow. The Soviet capital, Guderian asserted, was not just the political, transportation, and communications center of Russia, but in a telling analogy that illuminated the military mindset, the nerve center of Russia, like Paris is to France. Hitler had then argued the alternative. The raw resources and agricultural resources of Ukraine, he noted, were absolutely vital to the continuation of the war, as was securing the German oil supply. My generals, he remarked in a biting comment, know nothing about the economic aspects of war. It's a line that is repeated so often, it actually, it's amazing. As if, Hitler is the authority on what his generals know about. And frankly, his generals are responsible for fighting battles, not for building factories. Again, but although the day before he had asserted that an attack on the south by his armored group was impossible, Guderian now reversed himself and affirmed his ability to launch just such a drive. Yeah, it's pretty much the disaster that no one expected, and Halder was extremely bitter about it because, for all intents and purposes, Guderian folded. And that's a fact, and he denies that in his memoirs, but he basically folded, and by folding, he basically ensured that the Blitzkrieg was about to be ended, and the hopes of a victory were likely ended as well. So, according to Fritz, Hitler likely had a more realistic view than did Halder. Despite the failure of his key assumption, the latter produced no new plan for victory. The plan wasn't finished, right? I want to emphasize that. The plan had not been finished. The plan always was to go to Moscow. Now, the way they presented it to Hitler and the way they tried to play Hitler wasn't brilliant. I mean, if anything, you could say it was just incredibly wrong. But that was the plan. So there was no change to plan. It's like, you know what, you keep going and you drive for Moscow. That's where Stalin's sitting, that's where the rail networks converge. That's where a lot of industry exists. This is what you have to do. Where Halder, despite the evidence of increasing enemy resistance and eroding German strength, clung to the hope that one last blow would lead to the collapse of Soviet defenses, Hitler drew the conclusion dictated by his recognition that the war would not end in 1941. Securing economic resources had a higher priority than achieving another operational triumph. How do you call that a more realistic view? It's your hope of victory is actually in Moscow. It's your only hope. And yes, it's a gamble, but you're not going to secure victory by taking the Ukraine, or Leningrad for that matter. Okay. The seat of government is Moscow. The army is in front of Moscow. Whatever the Soviets have, it's now being funneled into the defense of Moscow. And they were in a panic. But we'll get to that. The enormous losses suffered by the Red Army at Kiev and in the first 3 months of the war seemed to justify the German assumption that an attack on Moscow, Operation Typhoon, could still succeed despite the lateness of the season. You know what? There was a lot of doubts about it. Right? I mean, I think even Halder's diary expresses misgivings about doing this, but they have to. I mean, it's the only choice they've got. But here's a really critical statement that I can definitely get behind. Guderian's already exhausted and depleted forces, however, had been further worn down in the Battle of Encirclement at Kiev. Their casualties had been high, while by late September, the 2nd Panzer Group had only 30% of its armored vehicles in service. The gasoline situation remained precarious, as it did throughout, by the way, while the redeployment of the Second Army and the Second Panzer Group from the Kiev area, hampered by incessant rain and muddy roads, took much longer than anticipated. Hallelujah. In other words, there's your argument for why you don't send them north and south. If you want to succeed in taking Moscow, you more or less had to keep them in place and let them fight in an eastward direction rather than north and south. That's where your delay is. That's a 1 month delay on top of a month of back and forth argument that I suspect had hampered the Army's advance as well, because the Army basically was held in place. And given how I want to acknowledge that German logistics were terrible, and they were chronically short on everything, and they cut things down to, you know what, fuel and ammunition, and everything else is like you're on your own, boys. So I acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge that, but they kept managing to pull this off. And the fact is, I think they would have pulled it off even late August if they had clear direction to go east. But instead, this argument developed, and if you read some of the rivalry between or disputes between the army command and the government, Hitler and his government, you get a sense that they whenever they didn't want to do something, they basically obstructed. And the whole supply situation and the Soviet counterattacking has this feel of being obstructing. It's like, well, we can't pull our forces out right now, we have to wait. And I think that's a large part of what was going on in August, is this attempt to delay with the hope that somehow or other Army Group North and South would be able to advance on their own. And so you wouldn't get a diversion that would take a month off your schedule. And as we'll see, I think that's pretty much why this turned into a war that lasted until 1945 instead of being settled at the end, by the end of 1941.